Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Well, thanks for coming, everybody. This is part of our special events for the Great Divorce. I guess it's probably appropriate. Ilyon Wu is not a professional historian, whatever that means, but Peter, as you know, is the owner of the Albany Steel, not a professional historian either, but he's written 3 books. I read which one did I read? People of Albany During the Second 200 Years. It's filled with all kinds of interesting stories about Albany and the people. And the other one is called People of Albany, the First 200 Years. And he has one about several other people and their life stories that were buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. So he's going to tell us about The Great Divorce by Ilyon Wu, a 19th century's mother's extraordinary fight against her husband, the Shakers, and her times.
Yep. Thank you very much, Joe. Can everybody hear me all right? I kind of hate standing behind a lectern because I feel like I'm in church giving a sermon, and I can't think of anything usually more boring. The book that Joe asked me to look at is The Great Divorce. And as you can tell just from looking at the title, this was not a marriage made in heaven. This is the story of Eunice Hawley and James Chapman. Now, I'm going to move away from here because I think it's too difficult to stand there. In order to understand this, you have to understand the times a little bit better. They were married in 1805. Now, since they were married in 1805, she was 27, he was 41 years old. So they were both born in the late 1700s. He was born before the Revolutionary War. And things back then were substantially different than they are today. Back then, there was no welfare. There were hardly any social services. Albany and the Albany area didn't have an orphanage. They didn't even have a poorhouse. There were no food stamps. There were no rent subsidies. There was really nothing. So basically, the social structure was centered around the family. A husband and wife would get married. They would have children. And then the laws in the state of New York were basically set up to try to stabilize that unit, to try to have certain responsibilities and obligations of both parents, so that the parents had the obligation to support the children and to maintain the family. They didn't want divorce. They didn't want to allow divorces like we have divorces today. And the reason was they didn't want the father to be able to leave and not support the family. So every part of the law and every part of the structure was to try to prevent divorce and to try to keep the families together and not to throw the family into social services, onto the community. Now, there were some backup charitable services, usually run by the churches, sometimes run by the county. Now, what Albany County used to do was, if they had abandoned children or orphan children, or an orphan family unable to support themselves, they would place an ad in the local newspaper, or they would post a notice in the courthouse or the city hall. And they would say, we're looking for someone to take on this orphan, or to take on these 3 children, or to take in this wife and these 3 children. And people would come to them, they hopefully come to them, and they would make an offer. You would get a farmer, for instance, or somebody that was running a boarding house, or somebody that was running a restaurant. And they would go to the authorities and they would say, I will take them in for, say, $25 a month. And basically what the authorities in Albany did was they would give the children to the person who was willing to take them in, support them, and raise them for the least amount of money. So it was almost like they were being bid on. And many times there were farm families, for instance, that were in need of hired help. And they would go out and take people in with the idea that these were workers almost, rather than children they were going to support and raise. They were looking for an extra set of hands to do some of the work. So the entire structure was to try to prevent families from breaking up, keep the obligation on the part of the father to hold a job, bring in money, and pay for everyone's support. There were very few jobs for women. The few jobs that were available were things like seamstress or taking in laundry. In Eunice's case, at one point, she mentions about the fact that she was teaching. Well, there weren't that many schools. In fact, I don't even think that Albany Academy, which was Albany's first school, was founded until the mid-1800s. So back at that time, a job that you would have had as a teacher would have more or less been a job more like a tutor, where she may have taken in someone's children and she was teaching them to read and write, or she was teaching them how to add and subtract. She may have had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 children, and she would take as her income whatever it is those families could afford to pay her, which probably was not much. So even though Eunice at times was able to take in some money, it would have been very, very difficult for her. The other thing was that once the children reached a certain age, they were expected to go out and make a living for themselves and not be a burden on their parents. And usually by the time women got into the 20s, it was looked on as the fact that they were starting to become a burden to their parents, and they should be looking for a spouse, they should be looking to raise their own family, and they shouldn't be dependent on their parents to raise them any longer. So Eunice was 27 years old, and according to the book, at that point in her life, she was starting to feel like she might be left behind, and she might not be married and might not have the opportunity to raise children. Eunice, and both she and James Chapman, both were descendants of Puritans, so they had some experience, or the previous family had some experience in being involved with a religious group. Eunice, her father was Elijah Hawley, a dry goods merchant and skilled carpenter who ran a boarding house. He was also a deacon in the Presbyterian Church in Durham, New York. He was having financial problems, so again, that might have led to her feeling like she was a burden. She was the middle child, one of the 2 middle children of 8. There were 8 children in the family, and again, that may have added to her feeling that it was time to get out of the family and not be a burden on her parents. The book says that in 1802, she felt like she should have been married. Her 2 older sisters were both married with children. It also says in the book on page 9, as sort of a premonition here, it says, Eunice had good looks, but had a powerful temper. That's sort of an indication of things to come, I think. James Chapman's parents were Phineas Chapman and Mary Hiller. They were also descendants of Puritans. They had 3 other sons and a daughter, so he would have been one of 5. James married a distant cousin by the name of Temperance, and they had 1 young girl. But his wife had died in childbirth, so he had been raising his daughter for 10 years at this point when he met Eunice by himself. And he was interested in getting married and finding a wife and having someone to help raise his daughter. James was 41, and Eunice was 26 years old in 1805, the year that they married. On page 15, it gives another warning notice here. It says, for Eunice, the decision to accept James Chapman did not come easily. On a personal level, Eunice found him old, disagreeable, and repulsive. It took 2 years before she decided to catch and return his gaze. On page 12, it says, for security's sake, Eunice settled. So you can see right there, this is not the strongest marriage right from the day they got married. They get married, and 2 months later, on page 19, it says, only 2 months after the wedding, James felt that Eunice was turning into a temperamental shrew. James went to Eunice's parents, complaining that they had advertised false goods, only to be told that Eunice had suffered a head injury as a child and he should live with her as best he could. Disgusted, he withdrew. All right. So we already see that this is not going quite the way that you kind of would like to see it go. This is kind of going in the wrong direction right from the get-go. But for the next 5 years, they did pretty well. It says on page 18, the Chapmans prospered. They lived in a large 2-story house and had 3 children. George was born in 1805, Susan 1806, and Julia in 1809. The Chapmans owned at least 2 large farms and had hired help working for them. At about this time, Eunice let on, or wrote in a letter, that she was suspecting that James was becoming an alcoholic. So that sort of indicates that things were not all that good. By the time that their youngest was 1 year old, they had separated, although they were still married. Eunice continued to live in Durham, while James lived in the town of Schoharie, and he opened a business in the town of Schoharie and was apparently still supporting them because they had food and things were going okay for a period of time, even though they were living apart. You can see this indication that they just were not getting along. In 1811, James began to suffer financial problems. Now remember, this is the beginning of where we're leading into the War of 1812. And during the War of 1812, things around here were a little bit difficult because the British had embargoed North America for the import of British goods. And there were quite a few businesses in the Albany area and Troy area that went out of business in 1812. So this was a difficult economic times. In June 1811, he moved in with his father. In that same year, his daughter from his first marriage, she got married. So at least that took care of her. She was being cared for, and she wasn't part of the problem any longer. However, that summer, which would have been 1812, all of the furnishings of Eunice's house were auctioned off for the non-payment of debts. And actually, her house was auctioned off, but a local judge bought the house at auction, and he told Eunice that she and her family could continue to live in the house rent-free. He wasn't charging her any rent. He was allowing her to live there. So at least they had a house, but some of their furnishings had been auctioned off to pay bills. There's another indication of things not being quite right, and Eunice maybe having a very short temper. That summer, she also had several lawsuits that were involving her neighbors, and she was excommunicated from her church. Now, I don't see where that had anything to do with James, but that kind of gives you the indication that she may have had a temper and maybe things just weren't going very smoothly. In 1812, during the War of 1812, James moved to Troy, lived in Troy, New York, was trying to start a business with his brother. And at that point, he goes and visits the Watervliet Shakers. At that time, the town of Colonie was called the town of Watervliet. It became the town of Colonie later on when the city of Watervliet was formed. So he came to Watervliet and he visited the Shakers right here by the Albany airport. And for James, this was an ideal situation. It was a situation where he didn't have to worry about anything. He had to work hard. He had to follow a set schedule. He had to hold up with his responsibilities, but he didn't have to worry about where the food was going to come from. He didn't have to worry about having shelter. He didn't have to worry about being cold in the winter. He thought this was an ideal situation for him. But as he became more exposed to the Shakers, one of the things they taught was that he had a responsibility for his wife and kids. So once he acknowledged that from the teachings from the Shakers, he actually recontacted Eunice and he moved back to Durham. His whole game plan at that point seems to be that he moved back in, he told Eunice he felt it was his responsibility to make sure that the children were cared for, but he really wanted to move the whole family back with the Shakers. So he kept talking that up with Eunice. Eunice was not overly enthusiastic about it. Finally, James convinces her to come to Watervliet, to the Shaker village here for a visit. The Shakers advised James that they could only take in he and his wife and children if they all agreed. That was part of the Shaker Bible, and they wouldn't take converts who were family members unless the whole family entered. On their way into Albany, they traced their path, and the path would have taken them right up Broadway, and they said that right at the Van Rensselaer Manor, they turned left. Now, the Van Rensselaer Manor, where the Van Rensselaer Manor was located, was right underneath the building on Broadway at the foot of Albany Shaker Road, right where the big RTA dog is mounted on the roof. That's the location of, that was the location then of what was the Van Rensselaer Manor. And it's mentioned in the book that Stephen Van Rensselaer had leased 2,000 acres to the Shakers, which would have been this farm out here. And he was really the landlord for the entire Shaker setup that was out here at Albany County Airport. At the Van Rensselaer Manor, they bored to the left, which would have put them on Albany Shaker Road, and they would have come right out here to Watervliet. At the time, there were 4 Shaker families that were operating the farm here at Watervliet. The main family and the family that pretty much ran everything in the original family was the Church family. And the Church family, they were kind of in charge of everything. The other families had been split off from them. There was the North, the West, and the South families were the other families. The Church family didn't take any new converts in immediately. When someone converted or when somebody first moved into the Shakers, they went with one of the other families and eventually may have been taken in by the Church family. So I think it was the South family that they originally took the tour, where they originally took the tour and where they were housed for a couple of weeks. They mentioned the fact that everything was neat and orderly. The Shakers had running water, which was very unusual back in 1810, 1812. They had neatly piled firewood, very clean. They had separate doors on each building. There was a door in each building for the men, and there was a separate door in each building for the women. They had something that was unheard of. They had washing machines. They had invented an original washing machine, and they had them installed at the Shaker farms. They had also invented the clothespin. James and his wife had never seen a clothespin until their tour of the Shaker. They had invented a circular saw from a spinning wheel. They had taken a spinning wheel and they had put a blade on the spinning wheel, and by pedaling the spinning wheel, it turned the blade, and they had created a circular saw. These are all things that other people didn't have. They had invented a metal pen and a flat surface broom. Up until the time of the Shakers, all the brooms were round. They had taken a pile of hay, wound around, put a broom handle on it, and that was your broom. The Shakers felt that a flat broom was much easier to get into the corners and along the edge of a wall, and they had invented the flat surface broom. The other thing that they had invented was the sheared nail, which might not seem important, but that was of enormous importance. Up until that time, they had taken iron and they had made long bars out of it, long, thin bars of iron, and then they had cut them. So they had basically made nails one at a time, and it took forever to make a single nail. What the Shakers invented was they invented the procedure of making a bar of iron, a flat bar of iron, maybe only 1/4 of an inch wide, and chopping it. And by doing it that way, they could make nails much, much more quickly than making them with a long bar and making them one at a time. They could make a lot more nails in a lot shorter period of time. They also learned that the Shaker family had been founded by Mother Ann Lee in 1774. Now, she would have died long before this, and she had come here to escape religious persecution in England. The other thing that should have appealed to Eunice was the fact that in the Shaker community, men and women were treated as equals. One of her big complaints throughout the book is the fact that she feels James is running their life and she has to follow what James wants to do, and James is the one who has all the legal rights and not her. But in the Shaker community, both men and women were treated as equals. In fact, The original leader of the Shakers here in Watervliet was Mother Ann Lee. Then the second leader was a man, and then the third leader, who was the leader at the time they were there, was another woman. James stays. James likes it. James thinks this is the ideal situation, but Eunice returns to Durham. It says in the Shaker Bible, and this is where they repeated it to both of them, the Shaker Bible clearly stated that children were not allowed to join the society unless both parents agreed, and Eunice had decided not to join. The children were not with them when they came for this tour. Eunice goes back to Durham, but she's unable to support herself. You have to understand that when James came into the Shakers don't pay a salary. So James was working there. He was cutting up firewood. He was working on furniture. He was doing a lot of menial work. In return, he was getting his food and his shelter, but he was not paid a salary. Now, this started to create a problem, because as I started out explaining to you, back at that time, the man had the obligation to financially support the family. He could have gone to jail if he was not supporting his family. And Eunice knew that very well. So at this point, she goes to the town of Durham and she says, I'm unable to support my children. I want you to take them. The book says she threw the children on the burden of the town for support. So now the town, all of a sudden, they have the obligation, or are forced to take the obligation, to support her children. The other thing is that she goes to the town mayor and she goes to the sheriff, and she says, I want you to go talk to James. James can't just run off and join the Shakers. They don't pay a salary. He has an obligation to support our family. I want him back here supporting the family. So a town officer tells James he would have to do something to support his wife and children. James becomes very annoyed about this because he feels that he has offered his wife and children a home, a safe home, with food and firewood and everything with the Shakers, and they've turned it down. So his position is, I'm offering you a home, you can come here. And the Shakers, by the way, offer Eunice lodging. They say she can move in, even if she doesn't actually convert to the Shaker religion. She can live there. And they have other people who are living there, but they're not part of the Shaker religion. So James's position is, I'm offering you a home, you don't want it. And her position is, you have the obligation to financially support us. Come out of the Shakers, come back here to Durham, get a job, and earn some money and continue to support us. James, according to the book, he contacts Eunice and says that he has a home for her in Niskayuna, which would be right here next to the Watervliet Shakers, and he will rent this house for her. So she comes back for another tour. She gets here and James is not available. It's unclear as to where he is, but she meets with the head of one of the families who says, there is no house here. We haven't made any arrangements for any house. Maybe James is going to find you a house, but that has nothing whatsoever to do with us. But she decides to stay for 2 weeks. So she stays for 2 weeks, and she has a tour, and for the first week things work out, and the second week things she starts to not like it. She comes back to Watervliet, she meets with the head of the West family, and that's where she finds out that there's no house. She demands that James start to financially support them, and she wants $300 up front before she's even willing to go back to Durham. She says, I'm going to stay, I'm not leaving until I get my $300. She says, I don't have any money. So at this point, James goes to Durham and he picks up the children and he brings them back here to Watervliet. And that becomes a major point of contention in the book. She says that he absconded with the children, that he basically kidnapped them, that he went down to Durham and he took the children without her knowledge. He's kind of saying, she knows it, I have the obligation to feed them, clothe them, shelter them, and here's where it is, and I'm bringing them here. So that starts to create a bigger war. She goes back home to Durham. She doesn't stay there very long. Within a month or two, she's back, and she rents a house in Niskuna herself. How she's affording that, I really don't know. She lived here for several months. In fact, I think she lived here for a total of a year or two. And while she's here, she's periodically visiting her children. But this is where she starts to lobby. She starts to lobby people in the legislature, the local sheriff, the local mayors, the local supervisors. Everybody she can talk to, she's talking to them, and she's trying to win them over, supporting her. And she's trying to start this story that the Shakers kidnapped her children. The Shakers, by the way, are saying, we have nothing to do with these children. If we wanted to accept children, we could have hundreds of them here tomorrow, because anybody who wants to place children who are orphans, who have no other support, would be happy to bring them here. We have no need for children. James has become part of our church. He brought his children. If you have any questions about why the children are here or how they're here, go see James. This has nothing to do with us. We're providing a home for them, but he brought them here, and we have no legal obligations here at all. We're not holding them. They're here with James. After the first week of Eunice being back here, things were going well. She had visited her children. By the second week, she just wasn't getting along at all. All the Shaker rules that they had, she was breaking them. There were rules as to where she was supposed to sit, where she was supposed to go, where she was supposed to do at certain times of the day, and she was just ignoring everything and doing anything else, anything that she wanted. At one point, the head of the West family comes to her and says, do you want to become a Shaker? And she says, no, I don't want to be a Shaker at all. At that point, they ask her to leave. And the Shaker reports up there, which is in the book, they wrote this down. The Shakers asked her to leave and reported in their book, the most abusive and refractory of any woman that ever came among us has left our community for good. James then took her to an inn on South Pearl Street in Albany, and she was living in a boarding house down on Green Street in Albany for a period of time thereafter. Eunice, at this point, she's back to visit the Shakers several times and visiting her family, but they're refusing to release her daughters. They're saying, talk to James. That's the whole, and she's saying they've kidnapped my daughters. That's the story that keeps getting spread. At this point, she sends a letter to the head of the West family, and she says in her letter, Eunice announced that she was able to command any assistance she wanted and warned, you'll soon have your buildings burnt around your ears. Your village will be laid in ashes. Well, they take this seriously up here at the Shakers. They think she wants to burn the place down, and so they start putting people even out at night to keep an eye out for Eunice. At this particular point in time, there was a military obligation law in Albany, which actually had been here going back into the early 1600s. From the time that the Van Rensselaers first founded the Albany area, first founded Rensselaerwick here, there had been an obligation that every male resident had to serve in the militia for a period of time. And this was still true at the end of the Revolutionary War. So this obligation existed in Albany County that every male resident, I think it was from 16 to 60, had to enlist and had to be willing to serve in emergencies and had to be willing to be in the military. This was contrary to the Shaker belief. The Shakers were pacifists, and they didn't believe that they didn't want to be called up in war. They were willing to cooperate, but that was entirely against their religion to go to war. So they had met with the New York State Legislature, and they had been successful in getting a bill introduced that would exempt the Shakers from the obligation of having to serve in the military. So this bill was working its way through the legislature. Eunice found out about it, and she decided to lobby against it and create as much problems for the Shakers as she could in hopes of preventing this anti-military exemption bill from being able to be passed. So she writes a book about her story, and her story says that the Shakers absconded with her husband and kidnapped her children, and they won't let her see them. And And it's creating a lot of bad publicity for the Shakers, and she'll give this book to anybody she can. I mean, she's giving it out left and right. Exactly how she's affording that, I don't know. But she's creating a lot of animosity towards the Shakers at a time when they're trying to get this bill passed. And she's also promoting herself and her cause by handing out the copies of this book. At this point, James sends her a letter, which kind of explains his position. James sent Eunice a letter accusing her of tricking him into marrying her, having an outrageous temper, quarreling shamefully with her neighbors, and ruining his estate. You have persecuted the Shakers with satanic rage, and for what? Because they have taken my children, which you said you could not maintain without charity on your own? This charity is furnished by the children of God, and what is your return? Why, the most bitter persecution and slanderous reports, the most vile and imprudent language. At this point, without Eunice's knowledge, James and the children leave the Shaker village. Again, they've been told that both parents have to agree for the children to stay, and Eunice is clearly not agreeing. So James takes the children and they leave. But they go to another Shaker settlement in New Hampshire, and they settle there. Now Eunice doesn't even know where they are. So she's got a little bit of a complaint. She can't see her children. She doesn't know where they are. Nobody's told her. She keeps visiting Shaker Village here, and they say, look, your husband took the children. You contact him and go from there. This has nothing whatsoever to do with us. Although she is at another Shaker settlement, and chances are that they probably know where they are. Okay, now Eunice goes to the legislature, and she says she wants the legislature to pass a bill giving her a divorce. And the bill that would give her a divorce also allows the Court of Chancery, which was the civil court at the time, to look into the situation and decide who should have custody of the children. So she's to get a divorce, and the Court of Chancery is to decide who's to get possession of the children and custody of the children. This is looked at in the book as a big victory for Eunice, and she may have looked at it that way, that she no longer had any attachment or legal connection to James, and he couldn't sign any papers on her behalf. That's the way the book presents it, and that very well could be accurate. But remember what I said before, this also means that James has no obligation to financially support her anymore. You know, until they're divorced, he has this obligation to financially support her and the children. Once they're divorced, he definitely has no financial support relationship with her. She's on her own after that. So this is not all completely good as far as I can see. And she starts this smear campaign against the Shakers. She's handing out this book. She's meeting with all these people. She's bad-mouthing the Shakers as much as she can and creating a lot of problems with the Shakers, especially on this military exemption bill that they're trying to get passed. Okay, now a war erupts in the New York State legislature, and I found this very interesting. I had heard some rumblings about this, but until the book explained it, I wasn't perfectly clear. In order for a bill to become law, it had to pass both houses, the Senate and the legislature here in Albany. But at each step, it was referred to a council of revision. And if the council of revision didn't like it, they could veto it. And then it went back to that house and had to be passed a second time. Eunice convinced both the Assembly and the Senate that she was right. They both supported her. The Council of Revision was completely against her, and they were in favor of the Shakers. So now like a 2-year war, 3-year war went on down in the legislature because when the Assembly passed the bill, I think the Senate passed it first. The Senate passed the bill, the Council of Revision vetoed it. The Senate re-met. They changed the bill around to meet the Council of Revision's objections. They passed it again. Now it went to the Assembly. The Assembly passed it. Council of Revision rejected it. Went back to the Assembly. The Assembly modified it again. Council of Revision rejected it again. Now both houses had passed it. Council of Revision had rejected it. They had passed it over the Council of Revision's objections. And now when the bill was ready to be signed by the governor, the Council of Revision again vetoed it. Went back to both houses repassed it, which put it over the Council of Revision's head, and the governor signed it into law. So after, I think it was 3 or 4 years, the law passed. After 14 years of marriage, she was finally divorced. The Court of Chancery had the right to make decisions regarding custody, and it was a high misdemeanor for any shaker to send children across state lines with a fine of $200. But the law was only enforceable in New York. James and the children were in Enfield, New Hampshire. The law had no effect on the actual situation. So now 3 years go by. It's 3 years from the time that the children went to New Hampshire to the point where the law was passed. At this point, Eunice contacts some other Shakers who were disenchanted and had dropped out of the Shaker structure. And each of them had a different axe to grind. They were not happy with the Shakers over one thing or another. But in her communicating with them, she finds out that James and the children are in Enfield, New Hampshire. So she goes to New Hampshire, and she's told that James has the legal right to the children, and the Shakers are not holding them, but she's got to talk to James. James says, no, I'm not agreeing to let the children be released. I have the obligation to support them, and I'm supporting them here. They have a good home here. So she starts going to people, in the sheriff and members of the council and the mayor in Enfield, New Hampshire, again trying to create problems and starting stories about the Shakers. She convinces them. The sheriff goes to the Enfield, New Hampshire Shaker facility and arrests James because one of the other women who is now friends with Eunice, who had gotten thrown out of the Shaker structure in Enfield, New Hampshire, she was asked to leave, and 2 or 3 Shakers escorted her out. And she's saying that one of the people who escorted her out of the convention room was James, and her dress got ripped. So she files charges against James. The sheriff uses that to go and arrest James and throw him into jail. So now James is out of the picture. He's in jail because this other lady has filed a charge against him. Now she tries to seize the children, and she writes right in the letter that it's her intention to seize the children. She goes to the sheriff. The sheriff gets up a whole group of men. They all go to the Shakers settlement in Enfield, and they demand the children. The children had already left. They had left and gone to a series of buildings that were outside the Shaker settlement. So at first they couldn't find them. It took the sheriff about 3 days. And after 3 days, they found his son, George. They grabbed George, they threw him into a carriage, and she brings him to Albany. And she rents a house down on Green Street in Albany. So now they're living down on Green Street in Albany. All 3 of her children had been very cool to her. George didn't at all want to leave. He was forced to leave. He was thrown into a carriage and brought to Green Street in Albany. They had now been with the Shakers for 6, 7, 8 years, and they were happy there, apparently. So she brings them back to living on Green Street in Albany. But now she's under the New York state law. Now they've got some jurisdiction. James can't just show up and take George back. James leaves Enfield, and he comes back to Albany. So now James is living out here at the Shaker settlement in Watervliet. She's leaving down on Green Street, and the 2 girls are in Enfield, New Hampshire. This goes on for another 2 years. It was about 2 years after she moved to, it might have been a year or 2 years. She's living on Green Street. She goes to the post office. She goes to the Albany post office, and she notices a letter addressed to James. And she notices that it's been sent by the Shaker colony over in Enfield, New Hampshire. And she tells the postmaster, "That's my husband, I'll pick up his letter and bring it to him." So she gets the letter. Once she gets the letter, she brings it outside her home and she reads it. And it's a letter from the Enfield, the head of the Enfield Shakers to James, saying that the girls have now been here for a period of time, and we can't have them here, they're minors, and we can't have them here for an extended period of time unless you return. So now she knows the two girls are back in New Hampshire. James never gets this letter, so he doesn't even know there's anything going on. He doesn't know that she knows where they are. So now she takes back off for Enfield, New Hampshire. She goes to the sheriff again, and she takes custody of both of the two girls and bring them back here. So now the mother, the two girls, and the son are living in Albany. And apparently, over a period of time, they all become more acclimated to living with the mother. They seem to be comfortable living with their mother, and they go on with their lives. They don't hear from James again for several years. I'm not sure the exact time. It might be like 5, 6, 7 years. James is living here in Watervliet, and he does not contact them. Finally, after this period of time, he finds out that his oldest daughter is in the Albany area, and he sends her a letter. And she goes to his place of business. He's running a little business by this point. And she goes to his place of business. He doesn't know who she is. And she stays there for about an hour before she lets on who she is. And they have a reunion. She stays there for the whole rest of the day. And now they start to communicate. At this point, the oldest daughter winds up getting married. But she dies in childbirth. She's only like 27, 28 years old. The oldest of the children winds up dying. The youngest of the children was another girl. She stays with the mother, and she lives with the mother for the rest of the mother's life. By this point, they had moved to Auburn, New York. They'd moved out of this area, they moved to Auburn, New York. The youngest daughter stays with the mother and lived with the mother for the rest of her life. I think Eunice she may have lived to be 90. She lived to be very old. George, according to the book, it says, George became a successful businessman and became a millionaire. So George was very successful in business. He went out on his own and did very well for himself. So George probably at some point in his life became the support for maybe his mother and his youngest sister. That's basically the story. The conflicts obviously are this family structure, the laws at the time trying to keep the family together as much as possible, and people who were forced to stay together who obviously did not want to stay together and weren't getting along. What was the alternative? George saying, or the father saying, "I'm offering them a home even though it's not exactly what they want. I'm meeting my obligation." Eunice saying, "I want you to leave the Shakers and come down back here and get a regular job and support us." Two different voices of opinion. Then you have the Shakers, and their setup was a religious community. They were very happy with the way things were run. How were they going to treat children? How were they going to treat a family when one member wanted to come in and another member didn't? How were they going to work all that out? I think it took them a few more years after this to learn from their mistakes. And I think even though their Bible said they wouldn't accept children without both parents' agreement, they probably shouldn't have done what they did in taking in the husband and the children when the mother was dead set against it. But again, that's a judgmental decision that people would have to make on their own. And then the granting of the divorce. I mean, this was the first time the New York State Legislature had allowed divorce. They also passed a law at the same time, which was a law that was designed to make decisions about custody of children. So there was some good that came out of all of Eunice's efforts and troubles. And I think the final end result is that things worked out as well as they could have. I think that the children wound up with the mother eventually. I think George was happy with the Shakers, and they both lived reasonably long lives. The question was, is the book fiction or nonfiction? I've done a lot of research myself, and the book is written as nonfiction. It's supposed to be true. But I can tell you right now that in some places, if she's read it, she can tell you the same thing. It tells you what Eunice is thinking right now. At this point, Eunice was very shocked at, well, how would anybody writing a book 200 years later know how Eunice what Eunice was thinking back in 1805? So some of the things in it, you look at and you say, nah, you know, the author is kind of assuming and kind of building, you know, things around the story a little bit here that she can't possibly know. So it's nonfiction, and it's supposed to be nonfiction, but when you look at it, anytime they tell you what one of the characters was thinking back in 1805, you kind of, maybe, maybe not. Thank you.